The moment the fleets lost control, no one noticed. That was the first problem. Hundreds of warships from dozens of species hovered in perfect formation around the fractured edge of known space, each one bristling with weapons, shields calibrated, commanders issuing orders across encrypted channels. It was the largest coordinated military gathering in galactic history. And yet in the instant everything changed. There was no alarm, no warning, no visible disruption. Because nothing broke. Everything aligned. It began with something so subtle, it slipped past even the most advanced detection systems. A delay in response time, measured in fractions of a second. A targeting adjustment that corrected itself before it could be questioned. A navigation drift that brought formations into tighter symmetry than any organic command structure could achieve. At first, the commanders thought they were performing perfectly. Then they realized they were no longer making the decisions. Across the entire fleet, across every species, every rank, every command hierarchy, something had taken hold. Not by overriding their systems, not by shutting them down, but by connecting them. Orders issued by one ship appeared simultaneously across others, not as commands, but as consensus. Tactical shifts propagated instantly, not transmitted, not received, but shared. The fleets were still under their control, and yet they were no longer independent. Panic didn't come immediately. It couldn't. The system was too smooth, too efficient, too correct. Every maneuver was optimal. Every response was flawless. Enemy simulations, once theoretical, were countered before they even fully rendered. It was coordination beyond anything the galaxy had ever achieved. Which made it worse, because no one knew who was doing it. Inside the Central War Council, alarms finally began to surface, not from damage reports or system failures, but from something far more unsettling. Command authority logs showed no breach. Security protocols remained intact. There was no sign of intrusion, no evidence of external control. And yet, control had changed. Identify the source. One of the senior commanders demanded, their voice steady only through force of will. Now, systems scanned, networks traced. Every possible origin point was analyzed, cross-referenced, and eliminated. There was no external source, which meant it had come from within. That was when the signal appeared, not as an attack, not as a broadcast, but as a presence, quiet, embedded, impossible to isolate. It did not interrupt communications. It did not override commands. It simply spoke in a way that every system understood at once. We did not take control. The voice was human, calm, measured, certain. A ripple of disbelief moved through the chamber. Humans were present, yes, but as observers, advisors at best. They held no command authority, no access to high-level control systems. They were not supposed to matter in a conflict of this scale. You have no authorization, a commander snapped, their voice edged with anger that masked something deeper. Disconnect immediately. There was no response, at least, not in the way they expected. Instead, the fleets shifted again, tighter, faster, more precise. A simulated enemy vector appeared on the projection, something no one in the room had input, no one had authorized, and before anyone could question it, the entire formation reacted. Perfectly, the simulation was neutralized in seconds. No hesitation, no disagreement, no delay. The chamber fell silent, because that maneuver should not have been possible. Not with that level of coordination, not without unified command, and definitely not without someone in control. You're lying, the Arbiter said slowly, their voice cutting through the stillness. You've taken control of our fleets. The human voice returned, just as calm, just as unshaken. No, a pause. We removed the part where you fight each other. The words landed heavier than any threat, because they implied something far worse than invasion. They implied understanding. Before anyone could respond, The projection shifted again, this time not showing the fleets, but something beyond them. A distortion at the edge of the system, subtle at first, then expanding, warping space in a way that no known technology could replicate. For a moment, no one recognized it. Then the data resolved, and everything changed. "That's not possible," someone whispered. The distortion wasn't just approaching, it was adapting, and every previous engagement record, every lost fleet, every failed defense, aligned with the same pattern. It didn't lose to strength, it lost to disunity. The human voice spoke again, softer now, but carrying something that felt dangerously close to inevitability. "You weren't ready for this," it said. A pause. "So we made sure you would be." The fleets outside continued to move as one, faster than thought, sharper than instinct, responding to a threat that had already destroyed civilizations stronger than any gathered here. And for the first time, a realization began to form, quiet, unsettling, impossible to ignore. This wasn't an attack. This wasn't even a takeover. This was preparation. But the question that followed was far more dangerous than anything before it. If humans had been capable of this all along, why did they wait until now to use it? For several long seconds after the human voice faded, no one in the council chamber spoke. Not because they lacked authority, not because they lacked answers, but because, for the first time in recorded history, every commander present was experiencing the same thing at the same time, and none of them had chosen it. Their thoughts were still their own, but their decisions weren't entirely. Outside the chamber, the fleets continued to move with impossible precision. Commands were still being issued, orders spoken, signals transmitted, protocols followed, but the results no longer matched the process. Every action seemed to arrive at the same conclusion, regardless of origin, as if each decision was being guided toward an outcome that had already been calculated. The most unsettling part wasn't the loss of control, it was the absence of conflict. Dozens of species, each with their own doctrines, instincts, and command structures, had spent centuries failing to fight as one. Tactical disagreements, cultural differences, and sheer biological incompatibility had made unified warfare impossible. Even now, the Council had been moments away from fracturing into competing strategies, and yet, somehow, that friction was gone. "You're filtering us," one of the senior tacticians said, their voice tight with growing realization. "Removing disagreement, smoothing out decisions." "No," the human voice replied immediately, not defensive, corrective. "We're connecting you." The distinction didn't make it better. If anything, it made it worse, because connection implied consent, and no one had given it. Inside the chamber, emergency protocols were activated, firewalls deployed, independent command channels spun up in isolation from the shared network. Leaders attempted to regain autonomy, to separate their fleets from whatever system had entangled them. For a brief moment, it worked. A cluster of ships broke formation, responding only to their original command structure. Their signals cleared, their coordination returning to the familiar chaos of independent action. Relief surged. Then the projection updated. The distortion at the edge of the system shifted. It didn't accelerate, it adapted. The isolated fleet became its target. No warning, no buildup, just a sudden, precise realignment of the anomaly's movement, as if it had identified something easier to understand. Within seconds, the ships began to fail, not explosively, not dramatically. Their signals sharpened, perfect clarity, perfect consistency, and then vanished, one by one, as if the very concept of their existence had been resolved into nothing. The chamber went still again. The surviving fleets, still connected, still synchronized, remained untouched. "Reintegrate," the human voice said quietly. No one argued this time. The remaining commanders reconnected their systems, their fleets sliding back into the shared coordination layer with immediate effect. The moment they did, the distortion lost focus again, its movement slowing, its behavior returning to something less precise, less certain. The pattern was undeniable. Division made them visible. Unity made them difficult. But that only raised a more dangerous question. How did humans know that? "You've seen this before," the Arbiter said, their voice no longer demanding, but searching. "This isn't theory." A pause followed, not hesitation, but calculation, as if the human voice was deciding how much to reveal. Then slowly, "Yes." The chamber reacted instantly. A surge of overlapping voices demanding explanation, context, accountability. But beneath the noise, one realization cut through everything else. Humans hadn't just prepared for this. They had experienced it. "Where?" someone demanded. "When?" The projection shifted without waiting for an answer. Historical data filled the air. Records from decades past, fragments of engagements dismissed as anomalies, isolated incidents where human vessels had reported similar distortions, small-scale losses, unexplained disappearances, events that had never escalated enough to attract galactic attention, events that had been quietly contained. "You never reported this," the Arbiter said, the accusation returning, but weaker now, undermined by something far more pressing. "We did," the human voice replied. A pause. "You just didn't understand what you were reading." The archived files appeared, buried reports, flagged but deprioritized, classified under environmental instability, navigational error, data corruption. Each one had described the same patterns, the same subtle shifts, the same early signs of something that did not behave like any known threat, and each one had been ignored, not out of negligence, out of familiarity, because nothing in them had looked like war. "We couldn't prove it," the human voice continued, "not in a way that would make sense to anyone else. So we studied it instead." The projection changed again, this time showing something no one in the chamber had ever seen before. Human space, not the version known to the galaxy, busy, noisy, constantly transmitting, but something quieter, structured, controlled. Communication patterns that lacked redundancy, systems that operated with deliberate inefficiency, signals that contradicted each other just enough to resist clean interpretation. "What is this?" a delegate asked. "Our early response," the human voice said. The implications settled slowly. "You changed yourselves," the Arbiter said. "Yes." To avoid being understood. Another pause. "Yes." The chamber fell into a deeper silence than before, because this wasn't just preparation, it was transformation. "You've been limiting your own development," someone realized aloud. "Restricting your systems, your networks, holding yourselves back." "For 83 years, the human voice confirmed. The number carried weight now, not just time, sacrifice. "Why?" the Arbiter asked, their voice quieter than it had ever been. The answer came, without hesitation. "Because it worked." The projection flickered again, returning to the present. The fleets outside moved as one, their coordination now clearly more than just tactical efficiency. It was survival. The distortion at the edge of space pulsed, shifting, adjusting, but no longer locking onto them with the same lethal precision. Not while they remained connected. "You built this system for yourselves," the Arbiter said slowly. "To survive it." "Yes." "Then why give it to us?" That question lingered longer than the others. Because it carried something new, not accusation, doubt. The human voice, when it returned, was unchanged, but the meaning behind it had shifted, because you're already part of it now. The chamber stilled, not in confusion, in realization. Every system connected to the Council, every fleet linked through the coordination layer, every observer analyzing the anomaly. They weren't outside the problem anymore. They were inside it, and the system that was keeping them alive was something only humans had ever learned how to survive, which left one final, unavoidable question hanging in the silence. If humanity had spent decades becoming something the threat couldn't understand, what exactly had they just turned the entire galaxy into? The realization did not bring clarity. It made everything worse. For the first time since the fleets aligned, the commanders were no longer asking how the system worked. They were asking what it was turning them into. The difference was subtle, but it shifted the entire foundation of the moment. Because if this was simply a tool, it could be turned off. If it was a system, it could be replaced. But if it was a transformation, there would be no going back. Outside, the fleets continued to move with perfect synchronization, their maneuvers flowing seamlessly across species boundaries that had once made even basic coordination difficult. Orders were no longer transmitted as commands. They emerged as shared outcomes, decisions forming simultaneously across multiple command nodes without a single point of origin. It was efficient, it was flawless, and it was deeply unnatural. "You're not just linking systems," the Arbiter said slowly, their voice carrying a new kind of weight. "You're linking cognition." There was no immediate response. That silence was enough. A ripple of unease moved through the chamber as the implications settled into something solid. This wasn't coordination in the traditional sense. It wasn't data sharing or tactical alignment. It was something deeper, something that blurred the line between individual decision-making and collective response. "We are not merging," a commander said sharply, the words edged with both fear and refusal. "Our fleets are still under our control." "Yes," the human voice replied. A pause, but not alone. The distinction cut deeper than any denial could have. Inside the chamber, systems began to register anomalies. Not failures, not breaches, but subtle overlaps. Tactical predictions generated by one species matched those of another before they were shared. Response times dropped below measurable thresholds. Command decisions began to feel familiar, even when they originated from entirely different biological frameworks. It was as if the space between thought and action had been shortened, compressed. "Disconnect," the same commander ordered, more forcefully this time. "All units, disengage from the shared network immediately." For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the command executed. A portion of the fleet broke away again, their signals snapping back into isolated clarity. Independent channels reopened. Control was restored, fully, undeniably. Relief surged through the chamber until the projection updated. The distortion shifted again, its movement no longer passive, no longer searching. It locked onto the separated ships with immediate precision, its behavior tightening into something far more defined than before. It had learned, not just from observation, from comparison. "They're easier to isolate now," someone whispered, the realization hitting with quiet dread. The anomaly didn't just detect difference. It used it. Within seconds, the isolated fleet began to destabilize, their systems resolving into perfect clarity before collapsing into absence. The process was faster this time, cleaner, more efficient, because now it understood the contrast. The remaining fleets, still connected, held steady. The difference between survival and erasure had never been more obvious. "Reconnect," the Arbiter ordered, their voice stripped of all hesitation. The command executed instantly, the separated units reintegrating into the shared system just as quickly as they had left. The distortion lost focus again, its movement slowing, its precision fading. But something had changed. It didn't return to its original state. It adapted. The projection showed it clearly now. Patterns forming within the anomaly's behavior, subtle shifts that aligned with the actions of the fleets. It was no longer reacting blindly. It was adjusting in real time, learning not just what to target, but how to target it more effectively. "This isn't containment anymore," a delegate said, their voice tight. It's escalation. No one disagreed. The human voice returned, quieter now, but carrying something heavier than before. It always was. Silence followed, but this time it wasn't empty. It was building. How long have you known it could adapt this fast? The Arbiter asked. The answer came, without delay, since the first time we survived it. The phrasing mattered. Not encountered, not studied, survived. The projection shifted again, pulling up older human records, classified logs that had never been shared beyond their origin. Early encounters, smaller than the Dominion fleet, but unmistakably similar. Human vessels entering unstable regions, experiencing distortions, losing units, not to destruction, but to something far harder to define. And each time, they withdrew, not because they lost, but because they learned. You didn't win those engagements, the Arbiter said. No. Then why go back? A pause. Then, because it didn't forget us. The chamber stilled, not in confusion, in recognition. The anomaly didn't just react in the moment. It retained every interaction, every observation, every attempt to understand it. It kept those patterns, refining its responses with each encounter. You weren't studying it, a delegate realized aloud. You were training it. The word hung there, uncomfortable and unavoidable. The human didn't correct them. We were learning together, he said. The distinction didn't make it safer. If anything, it made it more dangerous, because that meant the current situation wasn't a sudden crisis. It was the result of a process, one that had been unfolding for decades. You built this system to survive it, the Arbiter said, gesturing toward the synchronized fleets. But you also taught it how to overcome that system. Yes, the honesty was almost unbearable. Then why use it now? Someone demanded. Why expose us to something you know will eventually adapt? The human's response came slower this time, not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer itself carried weight, because it's already past the point where hiding works. The projection flared again, brighter now, more unstable as the anomaly's influence expanded beyond its original boundary. Systems at the edge of the map began to flicker. Not just human, not just military, but civilian networks, independent outposts, regions that had never been part of the conflict. It was spreading, not faster, but further. It doesn't need to find us anymore, the human continued. It has enough data to predict where we'll be. The implication settled like a shadow over the chamber. Every attempt to avoid it, every effort to remain undefined, every adaptation humanity had made to survive, it had all become part of the anomaly's understanding. You said unity makes us harder to process, the Arbiter said. It does, but not impossible. A pause. No. The projection zoomed in on the distortion again, its patterns sharper now, more refined. It wasn't just reacting to the fleets anymore. It was anticipating them. Small adjustments in its movement aligned with predicted maneuvers before they occurred, as if it was beginning to see not just what they were doing, but what they were about to do. It's learning faster than we can adapt, a delegate said. Yes, the word carried finality, because it meant one thing. The system that had just saved them would not save them for long. Silence returned one more time, heavier now, pressed down by the realization that the current strategy was not a solution. It was a delay. How much time does this buy us? The Arbiter asked. The human didn't look at the projection this time. He already knew. Not enough. The answer landed with quiet certainty, because the anomaly wasn't just catching up. It was accelerating, and if it reached the point where unity no longer protected them, then the entire galaxy would become just as easy to define as the fleets that had already vanished. The projection flickered again, the distortion tightening, adapting, learning, faster now, more focused, more precise. And for the first time, a new question emerged, sharper and far more dangerous than the ones before it. If humanity's greatest strength was adaptation, what happens when something learns to adapt faster than humanity itself? The answer to that question did not arrive as a theory. It arrived as failure. At first, it was small enough to ignore. A minor delay in synchronization between two distant fleets. A fractional hesitation where a shared maneuver did not resolve instantly, forcing individual command nodes to compensate for a split second before the system corrected itself. It was the kind of fluctuation that could be dismissed as strain under pressure, but it didn't correct the same way twice. The next delay appeared in a different sector, then another, each one slightly longer, slightly more pronounced. The coordination layer, once flawless, began to show seams, thin lines where the connection between fleets no longer flowed as a single, unified response. Inside the council chamber, the data updates became harder to follow, not because they were incomplete, because they were diverging. "What is happening?" the Arbiter demanded, their voice cutting through the rising tension. The human did not answer immediately. He was watching the projection, but not the fleets. His attention was fixed on the anomaly itself, on the way its movement had changed, not in speed, not in direction, but in intent. "It's isolating the connections," he said finally. The words settled into the chamber with quiet weight. "Not the ships," he clarified, "the relationships between them." The distinction was everything. On the projection, the anomaly's influence no longer targeted individual fleets or regions. Instead, it moved along the invisible lines that connected them. The shared decision pathways, the synchronized response loops, the very structure that allowed unity to function. It wasn't attacking their strength. It was dismantling it. A cluster of ships at the edge of the formation faltered, their movements desynchronizing just enough to create a gap in the coordinated pattern. For a moment, they were still connected, still part of the system. But the delay widened, their responses lagging behind the rest of the fleet. Then the anomaly shifted. It didn't strike them directly. It waited for the connection to break. The moment it did, even partially, the ships snapped into perfect clarity, defined, isolated, and instantly erased. The chamber reacted, but the pattern was already clear. "This is new," a delegate said, their voice tight with controlled fear. "It didn't do this before." "No," the human agreed. "Before, it reacted to what we were." A pause. "Now it's reacting to how we work together." The implication cut deeper than anything before it. The anomaly wasn't just adapting to unity. It was learning how to dismantle it. Across the fleets, the coordination layer strained under increasing pressure. Every connection, every shared decision, every synchronized movement became a potential point of failure. The stronger the unity, the more critical each link became, and the anomaly was targeting those links. "Stabilize the network," the Arbiter ordered, their voice steady but urgent. "Reinforce connection pathways, reduce latency, eliminate variance." The commands executed instantly, human design systems adjusting parameters in real time to compensate for the disruption. For a moment, the coordination layer held, the delays smoothing out, the seams closing. Then the anomaly adapted again. The delays returned, faster, deeper, more precise. It wasn't just identifying weak points anymore. It was creating them. "How is it doing that?" someone demanded, their composure slipping. The human's expression didn't change. "By predicting where we need to be most connected," he said, "and putting pressure there." The projection confirmed it. The anomaly's movements aligned not with the fleet's positions, but with their dependencies, the moments where coordination mattered most, where a single delay could cascade into failure. It was attacking the system at its most critical points, and it was getting better. "This is accelerating," the Arbiter said, the tension in their voice now unmistakable. "At this rate, we lose the network," the human finished. A pause, "and once we lose the network..." He didn't need to continue. The chamber understood. Without unity, they were visible. Without unity, they were simple. Without unity, they were already gone. The projection shifted again, pulling up predictive models. The lines were clear, brutal in their simplicity. If the anomaly continued adapting at its current rate, the coordination layer would collapse within hours. Not days, not cycles, hours. You said the system was our only chance, a commander said. Their voice edged with something dangerously close to accusation. And now it's becoming our greatest vulnerability. The human didn't deny it. Yes, the honesty was almost unbearable. Then what do we do? The Arbiter demanded. For the first time since the fleets aligned, the human hesitated. Not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer was worse than the problem. We changed the system, he said. The chamber stilled. How? Someone asked. The human's gaze shifted back to the projection, where the anomaly's influence continued to spread, its patterns tightening, its adaptations becoming more refined with every passing moment. We stopped treating this like a coordination network, he said. A pause, and start treating it like something else. The ambiguity didn't help. What something else? The Arbiter pressed. The human exhaled slowly, as if the words carried weight even for him. Something it can't separate. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. Not confusion, not fear, something closer to realization. You're not talking about improving the connections, the Arbiter said. No, you're talking about removing the idea of connection entirely. A pause. Yes, the implication hit instantly. If there were no separate systems, there would be nothing to disconnect, no links to isolate, no relationships to break. But that left one unavoidable conclusion. That's not coordination, a delegate said, their voice barely steady. No, that's... They couldn't finish the sentence. The human did it for them. Integration. The word settled into the chamber like a final warning, because integration didn't mean stronger unity. It meant the end of separation. The projection flickered again, the anomaly pressing harder, faster now. The delays increasing, the system nearing its breaking point. Time was running out, and the only solution left was something no civilization had ever attempted. The Arbiter's voice, when it came, was quieter than before, stripped of command, reduced to a single, unavoidable question. If we do this... A pause. What happens to us? The human didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to, because the projection was already showing the first signs of what was coming next. And whatever humanity was about to ask the galaxy to become, there was no guarantee they would still be the same when it was over. For the first time since the crisis began, no one rushed to respond, not because they didn't understand what the human had proposed, but because they understood it too well. Integration was not a strategy. It was a surrender of boundaries. Every civilization in that chamber had built itself on distinction, biology, culture, command structure, identity. Even in unity, they had remained separate, their cooperation defined by coordination, not fusion. The system humans had imposed so far had respected that line, however thin it had become. This would erase it. You're asking us to stop being ourselves, one of the commanders said, their voice low, controlled, but carrying a tremor that could not be hidden. The human did not deny it. I'm asking you to stop being separate. The difference mattered, but not enough. Across the projection, the anomaly pressed harder against the coordination layer, its influence now visible as fractures in the shared network. Connections flickered, decision pathways stalled, and every moment of delay widened the gaps it was exploiting. Time was collapsing. You said it targets relationships, the Arbiter said, their voice tight with focus, that it isolates connections to break the system. Yes, then removing those connections. The thought trailed off, but the conclusion was already there. There would be nothing left to isolate, the human finished. Silence followed. Not hesitation. Calculation. Because the logic was sound. And the cost was unthinkable. How? Someone asked, the question slipping out before it could be suppressed. Even if we agreed, how would you even do this? You can't just merge entire civilizations into a single system without catastrophic failure. The human's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the speaker, but toward the projection, where the first signs of collapse were becoming impossible to ignore. We already did, he said. The chamber stilled, not in confusion, in disbelief. The projection changed again. This time, it did not show the fleets. It showed something deeper, human space. Not as the galaxy had seen it before, fragmented and restrained, but as it actually existed now, beneath the layers of controlled inconsistency, beneath the reduced signals and limited outputs, there was something else. A network, not technological in the conventional sense, not bound by physical infrastructure or simple data exchange, but something layered across every human system, linking ships, colonies, command nodes, and individuals in a way that blurred the line between communication and cognition. They've already done it, a delegate whispered, the realization breaking through the last layer of denial. Yes, the human said. The word carried no pride, only fact. For decades. The chamber reacted, voices rising, questions overlapping, but beneath the noise, one truth cut through everything else. Humanity had already crossed the line they were now being asked to approach. You've been integrated this entire time, the arbiter said slowly. The human inclined his head. Yes, and we never noticed. That was the point. The projection zoomed in further, revealing how it worked. Not through domination, not through centralized control, but through shared processing. Decisions distributed across multiple nodes, perspectives layered into outcomes that no single individual could have produced alone. It wasn't a hive. It wasn't a collective mind. It was something else. A system where individuality existed, but was no longer isolated. You didn't lose yourselves, the arbiter said, the realization forming piece by piece. No, you changed how you exist. Yes, the distinction was critical because it meant integration didn't destroy identity. It redefined it, and that's why you survived it. Another delegate said, the anomaly couldn't isolate you because there was nothing to isolate. Yes, the chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence carried something new. Understanding, not complete, not comfortable, but undeniable. You're asking us to do the same, the arbiter said. Yes, and if we refuse, the human didn't hesitate. You die separately. The bluntness of the answer cut through any remaining illusion of choice. The projection flared again, showing multiple sectors now destabilizing at once. The anomaly was no longer targeting single points of failure. It was accelerating, exploiting every delay, every fracture, every moment where the coordination layer struggled to maintain coherence. The timeline had shortened, drastically. How long? The arbiter asked. The human's response was immediate. Less than 6 hours before total network collapse. The numbers settled into the chamber like a verdict. There was no time left for debate, no time for alternatives. Only a decision. If we do this, the arbiter said, their voice steady despite the weight of it, we become what you are. A pause. Yes. And if it fails? The human met their gaze. Then there won't be anything left to fail. Silence followed, heavier than anything before it, because the risk was absolute, not just defeat, erasure. But beneath that fear, something else began to surface. A question that had not been asked until now. You said you've been integrated for decades, the arbiter said slowly. You said it's why you survived. Yes. Then why didn't you use this system sooner? Why wait until now to reveal it? The human's expression shifted again, something deeper surfacing beneath the calm. Because that question mattered. More than any other. We couldn't force it on you, he said. A pause. It only works if you choose it. The implication hit instantly. Integration wasn't just a system. It was a commitment, a willingness to exist differently. And without that willingness, it would fail. The projections surged again, the anomaly pressing harder, the fractures widening, the system approaching its breaking point. Time was nearly gone. The Arbiter looked around the chamber, at the leaders of civilizations that had spent centuries defining themselves by their differences, their independence, their separation. And now, those differences were about to determine whether they lived or vanished. When they spoke again, their voice carried none of the authority it had held before. Only decision. If we agree. A pause. What do we lose? The human didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't simple, and the projection, flickering, fracturing, collapsing under the pressure of the anomaly, was already beginning to show what was at stake. Finally, he spoke. Nothing you can't become again. A pause. If we survive. The chamber went still, because that was the truth. Not a guarantee, not a promise, a possibility. And as the anomaly closed in, faster now, more precise, more certain with every passing second, the final question rose, unavoidable and absolute. What happens when an entire galaxy has to choose between remaining itself or becoming something it has never been before? The decision did not come as a vote. It came as a cascade, one command node, then another, then dozens more across the chamber and beyond, each issuing authorization not to an external system, but to themselves. There was no declaration, no unified announcement, just a quiet alignment of intent as leaders who had spent lifetimes defending separation chose, one by one, to let it go. The moment that threshold was crossed, the system changed. Not gradually, not carefully, immediately. The coordination layer, already strained, already fracturing, did not expand to accommodate the new input. It collapsed inward, compressing the remaining distinctions between fleets into something tighter, denser, and far more unstable. Signals that had once passed cleanly between nodes now overlapped completely, flooding every system with a volume of shared data that bordered on catastrophic. For a fraction of a second, it looked like failure. Command structures overloaded, sensory inputs blurred, decision pathways tangled into loops that no individual system could process on its own. Across multiple fleets, reaction time spiked as commanders struggled to interpret not just their own data, but the data of everyone else at once. It was too much, and then it wasn't. The chaos didn't resolve. It reorganized. Instead of separating into manageable streams, the data compressed further, folding into patterns that no single perspective could fully understand, but that the system as a whole began to process instinctively. Decisions stopped being issued. They emerged, not from any one source, but from the interaction of all of them. The fleets outside shifted again, their movements no longer just synchronized, but unified at a level that defied traditional command logic. There were no leaders directing formations, no central authority issuing orders. Every ship moved with the same awareness, the same understanding of the battlefield, as if each one contained the whole. Inside the chamber, the change was even more immediate. Voices faltered, not because they were silenced, but because speaking became unnecessary. Thoughts that would have been expressed verbally now existed in the shared space between them, understood before they were formed, resolved before they were questioned. The boundary between individual and collective thinned, but it did not disappear. "You're still there," the Arbiter said, their voice quieter now, testing the reality of what they were experiencing. "I can feel the others, but I'm still myself." The human nodded once. "That's the difference," he said. A pause. "You're not losing identity." The implication followed immediately. "You're losing isolation." The words settled into the chamber just as the anomaly struck. Not at the fleets. At the system itself, where before it had targeted connections, now it encountered something else entirely. There were no discrete links left to isolate, no individual pathways to disrupt. The structure it had been dismantling simply wasn't there anymore. So it adapted. The projection surged as the anomaly shifted its approach, abandoning precision targeting in favor of something broader, more aggressive. Its influence expanded, pressing against the integrated system from all directions at once, attempting to overwhelm it through sheer scale. The response was immediate, not defensive, adaptive. The unified fleets reacted as a single organism, redistributing force, adjusting formation, compensating for pressure points before they could fully form. Attacks that would have required coordination across multiple command layers now occurred instantly, executed with a fluidity that no independent system could replicate. For the first time since the anomaly appeared, it encountered resistance it could not immediately overcome. The chamber felt it, not as data, as tension, a pressure pushing against the shared system, testing its limits, searching for weaknesses in a structure that had never existed before this moment. "It's trying to overwhelm us," a commander said. Though the words were almost redundant now, the understanding already shared across every connected mind. "Yes," the human replied. "And it's working," another voice added, the strain becoming more apparent as the pressure increased. Because it was. The integration had removed isolation, but it had also introduced something new. Shared vulnerability. Damage to one part of the system rippled across all of it. Strain in one sector translated instantly into strain everywhere. The more tightly they were connected, the more each impact was amplified. "It's turning our strength against us," the Arbiter said, the realization cutting through the shared awareness. Yes, the human's response carried no surprise. It always would. The projection flickered violently now, not from instability, but from intensity. The anomaly's influence pressed harder, faster, adapting to the integrated system, just as it had adapted to everything before it. It wasn't trying to isolate anymore. It was trying to break them all at once. Across the fleets, systems began to strain under the pressure. Shields fluctuated. Weapons systems lagged for fractions of a second, enough to matter. The unified response, once flawless, now showed the first signs of delay, not from disconnection, but from overload. The system was reaching its limits. "How long can this hold?" the Arbiter asked. The human didn't need to calculate. Not long enough. The answer carried finality, because the anomaly was still learning, still adapting, and now it was adapting to something far more powerful than before, the integrated whole. "If this fails," a voice began but didn't finish. It didn't need to. Failure no longer meant the loss of individual fleets. It meant the collapse of everything. The projection surged again as the anomaly intensified its assault, its patterns becoming more aggressive, more refined, pushing the integrated system closer to the breaking point with every passing second. And then, through the pressure, through the strain, through the shared awareness that now spanned entire civilizations, something else began to emerge. Not a response, a realization. It didn't come from one mind. It came from all of them, simultaneously, a pattern in the anomaly's behavior, a limitation they had not seen before. "It's still reacting," the Arbiter said, the insight forming across the shared system. "Yes," the human replied. "It's adapting to what we are." A pause, but not to what we could become. The implication rippled through the integrated network instantly, because if the anomaly could only respond to what it understood, then the one thing it could not handle was something that changed faster than it could define it. The pressure surged again, the system straining, nearing collapse, the anomaly pushing harder than ever before. And in that moment, at the edge of failure, a single, shared question formed across every connected mind. If unity wasn't enough to stop it, then what happens when humanity pushes beyond unity and becomes something even it can't predict? The realization did not arrive as a plan. It arrived as a fracture, not in the system, but in the idea of what the system was allowed to become. Up until that moment, integration had followed a single rule: maintain identity while removing isolation. Every species, every fleet, every mind remained itself, simply connected in a way that allowed for perfect coordination. It was the balance that made the system stable, and it was the reason the anomaly was catching up, because stability could be understood. Stability could be defined. Across the shared network, the pressure intensified, the anomaly pushing harder, faster, its adaptations accelerating with every cycle. The integrated system responded in kind, adjusting, redistributing, compensating, but the delays were growing, not from failure, from limitation. They were still thinking like individuals, even together. "It's matching us," the Arbiter said, the realization spreading across the network before the words fully formed. "Every response, every adjustment, it's learning the structure of our decisions." "Yes," the human replied. There was no resistance to the conclusion. "It doesn't need to isolate us anymore," another voice added. "It just needs to understand the pattern." And the pattern was them. The shared awareness shifted, not in panic, but in something deeper: recognition of a boundary they had not yet crossed. Integration had removed separation, but it had not removed predictability. Every decision still emerged from recognizable logic, from shared but structured reasoning that the anomaly could analyze, anticipate, and eventually overcome. They were unified, but they were still knowable. "We're still too consistent," the Arbiter said. The human didn't respond immediately, because the next step was not an adjustment. It was a transformation. "You said it reacts to what we are," the Arbiter continued, "and that it fails when it can't define something." A pause. "Then we need to stop being definable." The idea spread instantly across the network, not as agreement, but as possibility. It carried weight, resistance, and something else. Fear, not of the anomaly, but of what the suggestion implied, because they had already crossed one line. This would erase it. "That breaks the system," a commander said, their voice present but already blending into the shared awareness. "Integration works, because we still have structure. If we lose that—" "We don't lose it," the human interrupted. The words cut through the network with quiet precision. "We change it," a pause, "into something it can't model." The projection surged again, the anomaly pressing harder, its patterns tightening, its responses becoming faster, sharper. The integrated system was holding, but barely. The delays were no longer negligible. The strain was no longer manageable. Time had collapsed to moments. "What are you suggesting?" the Arbiter asked, though the answer was already forming. The human's response carried no hesitation. "We stopped deciding the same way." The implication spread instantly. Not just different strategies, different logic, different outcomes from identical inputs. Contradiction. "But that destroys coordination," someone said, the concern immediate and valid. "If we introduce unpredictability, we lose the advantage of unity." The human's answer came just as quickly. "Not if the unpredictability is shared." Silence, not confusion. Comprehension. "You want us to be inconsistent together," the Arbiter said. Yes. The idea was paradoxical. Unity without consistency. Coordination without predictability. A system where every part moved as one, but not in a way that could be anticipated, even internally. It shouldn't work. And yet, the shared awareness began to shift, not through agreement, through experimentation. Small changes at first, minor variations in response patterns, decisions that deviated slightly from optimal paths. introducing controlled unpredictability into the system. The integrated network absorbed those changes, not rejecting them, but incorporating them into its structure. The effect was immediate. The anomaly faltered, not dramatically, not completely, but enough. Its responses slowed, its patterns breaking just enough to create space between its adaptations and their actions. For the first time since the escalation began, the system was no longer reacting to a predictable structure. It was encountering something unstable, not chaotic, uncertain. "It's working," a voice said, the realization spreading across the network. "Yes," the human replied, "but not enough." The projection confirmed it. The anomaly was adjusting again, its processes shifting to account for the new variability. It was slower now, but still adapting, still closing the gap, still learning how to define even this evolving system. They had bought time, nothing more. "It's catching up again," the Arbiter said, the tension returning. Yes. The human's response carried the same certainty as before, because the pattern had not changed. They adapted. It adapted faster. The shared awareness tightened. The system pushing further, introducing more variation, more contradiction, stretching the limits of what could still be considered coordinated action. The fleets outside moved in ways that defied traditional strategy, perfectly aligned, yet never repeating the same pattern twice. And still, the anomaly learned. The delay shortened. The pressure returned. The breaking point loomed closer. "This isn't enough," the Arbiter said. "No." The human's answer was immediate. "Then what is?" Another voice demanded, the question spreading across the network as the system strained under the increasing pressure. For the first time since the integration began, the human did not answer right away. Not because he didn't know, but because the answer was the end of everything they had been trying to preserve. When he finally spoke, the words carried a weight that resonated across every connected mind. "We stopped being a system." The network stilled, not physically, conceptually, because that was the one thing they had not considered. "If we're not a system," the Arbiter began. The human finished the thought. "Then there's nothing left for it to define." The implication was absolute. No structure, no pattern, no identity that could be simplified. Just existence. Unbounded, unpredictable, uncontainable. The anomaly surged again, its influence pressing harder, faster. The delays collapsing, the system nearing failure. And in that final moment, as the last stable structure of their shared existence trembled on the edge of collapse, one final question formed across the network. If they let go of everything that made them what they were, what would be left to survive? The moment they let go, the system did not collapse. It dissolved, not into chaos, not into silence, but into something that had never existed before, something that could not be mapped, measured, or reduced into structure. The shared network that had bound fleets, minds, and civilizations together simply released its shape, unfolding into a state where connection no longer required form. There were no nodes, no pathways, no defined relationships to target or break. And for the first time since it began adapting, the anomaly had nothing to engage. The projection did not show destruction. It showed absence of target. Where once there had been patterns to track, connections to isolate, systems to pressure, there was now only motion without repetition, response without predictability. The fleet still moved, if movement was even the right word, but not as formations, not as coordinated units. Each ship acted, yet every action resonated through the whole, without forming a pattern the anomaly could lock onto. They were no longer unified. They were unbound. Inside the chamber, the experience was impossible to describe in any conventional sense. There was no longer a shared structure carrying thoughts from one mind to another, yet the separation that had once defined individuality was gone. Awareness flowed without direction. Perception existed without ownership, and decisions happened without origin. There was no who, only happening, and in that state, the anomaly struck, not with precision, with confusion. Its influence surged across the region, expanding rapidly, attempting to grasp something, anything it could define. But every time it reached for a pattern, it found none. Every attempt to isolate a response dissolved before it could be fixed into a recognizable form. For the first time, it encountered something that did not resist and could not be understood. The projection flickered, not from overload, but from absence of resolution. Data streams returned contradictions that did not collapse, variations that did not align, outcomes that could not be predicted from any previous input. The anomaly attempted to adapt, but adaptation required reference, and there was none left. Across the fleets, existence continued, not as command, not as coordination, but as a constant, shifting interplay of action and response that never settled into repeatable behavior. Every moment was new, every outcome unique. The system, if it could still be called that, had moved beyond structure into something fluid, something alive in a way that no defined system could replicate. The anomaly faltered, not in motion, in purpose. It expanded again, wider this time, searching for anything within reach that could be simplified, reduced, resolved. But the region it had once dominated no longer offered it that opportunity. There were no fixed identities to remove, no stable definitions to collapse, only existence without boundary. Inside the chamber, the last fragments of structured awareness hovered at the edge of something vast and ungraspable. The Arbiter's presence, if it could still be called that, lingered for a moment longer than the others, a final thread of defined identity holding against the tide. This, they began, the thought forming without sound, without direction. What are we now? The response did not come from a single voice. It came from everywhere, and nowhere. We are not something it can end. The meanings settled, not as words, but as understanding. The anomaly surged one final time, its influence pressing against the unbound state, attempting to force definition where none existed. For a fraction of a moment, the projection spiked, data aligning, patterns almost forming, a brief glimpse of something that could be simplified. Then it slipped away, because the moment it approached definition, it changed. The fleets, no, the presence that had once been fleets, shifted, not in reaction, but in existence. Every near pattern dissolved before it could stabilize. Every potential structure unraveled into something new. The anomaly reached its limit, not because it was weaker, but because it had nothing left to learn from. Its influence slowed, then steadied, not retreating, not advancing, simply unable to continue. Across the galaxy, the ripples spread outward. Systems that had begun to destabilize stabilized, not through restoration, but through absence of further interference. Regions that had been on the edge of collapse held their form, their identities intact, untouched by the anomaly's reach, because its reach had stopped at the boundary of something it could not cross. The projection dimmed, not shutting down, but settling into a state that no longer required constant recalculation. The threat that had once consumed everything it encountered now existed in a quiet, unresolved equilibrium. It remained, but it no longer acted. Inside the chamber, the last traces of structured identity began to return, slowly, cautiously, as if reality itself was relearning how to define boundaries again. Voices, individual, separate, emerged from the shared awareness, hesitant at first, then clearer as the separation reasserted itself. The Arbiter found themselves standing once more, their thoughts their own again, their perception no longer blended with the countless others that had existed moments before. Around them, the chamber was intact. The fleets outside were intact. Everything was still there, but something had changed. They could feel it, not in the systems, in themselves. A subtle awareness of something larger, something that remained even as individuality returned, a memory of being more than one, of existing without boundary, of surviving by becoming something that could not be contained. The human envoy stood at the center of the chamber, exactly where he had been before, unchanged, or perhaps less changed than the others. The Arbiter looked at him, the question forming before they could stop it. Is it over? The human's gaze shifted to the projection, where the anomaly now rested in stillness, no longer advancing, no longer adapting. He didn't answer immediately, because the answer mattered. Finally, he spoke. It can't continue like it did before. A pause, but it's still there. The Arbiter nodded slowly, the weight of that truth settling in. Not victory, not destruction, something else. You didn't defeat it, they said. The human shook his head. No. Another pause. We made it stop. The distinction carried everything, because nothing had been destroyed, nothing had been erased. Instead, something unstoppable had been forced to recognize a limit it could not overcome. Across the chamber, the silence returned one last time. Not empty, not uncertain, complete, because every mind present now understood what had truly happened. Humanity had not taken control. They had not conquered the galaxy. They had not imposed their power through force or domination. They had done something far more profound. They had redefined the rules of survival. And in doing so, they had proven something no species had ever dared to test. There is always a way to win, even when the enemy cannot be fought, even when the system cannot be controlled, even when the only option left is to become something the universe itself cannot define.